Audio Snobs back in town, and today we've got some dirty little secrets for you. We're going to expose the behavior of synths and electronic keyboards when mixing them. Let's go. So guys, let's just shall we talk about some favorite synths, some iconic synths?
Yeah.
Go on, go for it.
The most iconic for me is the Mini Moog.
I agree. Totally
agree. It's just a little beast. And when you look at the history of it, it's kind of unique. Apparently, it was built from scraps from modular synths.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. And Bob Moog's company in New York in the early 70s, I think.
Yep, that's right.
And as with any great design, it was a mistake. There's a few mistakes involved.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, right. Initially, the VCAs were designed, but he miscalculated the output levels and created amplifiers that drove the filters by 10 to 15 dBs too much.
That explains a lot.
Right, it does explain why it growls, right? And then the other thing that was very unique to it not unique at that moment, but important and fundamental in the sound was discrete transistors rather than integrated circuits, because in the early 70s, integrated circuits sounded like shit. They did, Yeah,
I remember the radio.
These days, these days now the ICs are pretty damn good. They do have a certain sound, but it's a different ball game, as illustrated by SSL and subsequent companies.
Absolutely.
So that was my. The third massive thing about any piece of audio equipment, as Chris alluded to in the conversation we had regarding drums when he has said distortion.
Yeah.
Now, the filter is the distortion unit. It's either a high pass, low pass, band pass.
It's true, isn't it?
Not sure. Yeah.
Distortion by way of resonance.
Right. So the Moog ladder filter was nobody had come up with that before. A 24 dB per octave filter. That when you look, the reason they called it a ladder filter was because when you draw out the schematic, it looks like a ladder. It was a series.
It ramps, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. It was a series of resistors and transistors and capacitors.
It's stepped, basically. Yeah.
Yes, and a lot of people copied him. But he was certainly the originator, and of that, we call this subtractive synthesis, right?
We do indeed, yes.
Right. So
because of that filter, that's all.
Because of the filter, we're subtracting the harmonics rather than adding.
You can cut off high frequencies, yeah.
Right. So as with all of our conversations, when we always talk about sound, there's always going to be distortion involved.
Yeah.
So that's my little intro to.
I like that, Marcel, and I'm going to pick up on that because, let's be honest, of all the synths I've ever used, the Mini Moog has the dirtiest secrets of the lot. It is a beast. It is huge sounding, isn't it? I mean, the bottom end on
nothing like it.
I agree. I mean, I used to brag that I could make any control room in the world rattle with a Mini Moog bass sound. And when I asked to prove it, I proved it. It always works. Any control room, I can make it rattle with a Mini Moog on a bass sound. Now, nothing's come anywhere near that, have they? So, for instance, I'd like to sort of say to younger producers, modern producers, if you want to recreate that huge fat bottom end that you get out of a Mini Moog, come on, guys, there's one obvious way to me to do it. There's one.
Do tell, yeah.
No, I mean, I work with the Orb, and our favorite thing was to ram the Mini Moog through 2 SVT cabs. In a room full of boxes, so you took away all the resonance, and then record that, and then send that back through the Moogs through the same filters and drop the frequency even further. And that, I can assure you, didn't just rattle the room, it rattled the building. We used to get phone calls from the kitchen downstairs because you could hear all the plates crashing out of the cupboards behind them.
Yeah.
Just going, stop. And we're going, oh.
Wow.
But yeah, no. I mean, I've taken Mini Moogs down really low.
But if you're trying to replicate that with something that's not a Mini Moog, how are you going to do that? EQ, surely. EQ and a bit of saturation?
Sure.
Yeah, you never, I mean, there is something unique about it though, isn't there? I mean, because if you try to look at it scientifically, if you create a sine wave at about 50, 60 hertz, that is pure bass. Yeah. But somehow a Mini Moog pumping out a pretty pure tone at that frequency is a completely different beast.
Sine wave, yeah.
Do you know what interests me here is, the Mini Moog does not have a sine wave. So immediately we're talking about a triangle wave. That is the simplest waveform available on a Mini Moog. So maybe that's got something to do with it. There are extra harmonics. There's no such thing as a sine
and
wave.
that triangle's being driven through the filter by overdriven through the filter. So it's changing from triangle into
even more harmonics,
curves,
Maybe we're getting at something here. I like it. But hey, come on, guys. Say you've got a Moog patch on a modern plugin or just another synth, and you just want to make it more Moogy. Surely a bit of EQ and maybe some saturation is going to achieve what
again, the Moog UAD Moog plugins are excellent because they've got that saturation as the algorithm.
Well, to be honest with you, most of the Moog plugins are pretty damn good.
They are, yeah.
They're pretty damn. The Arturia Mini Moog is really good. The G4.
Oh yeah, well, Arturia really is the company to look at here because they've successfully modelled a lot of the classic synthesizers.
Absolutely. There's only one that they didn't get well for me, and believe it or not, it's the Jupiter 8.
Yeah, well, that's hard to get though, isn't it?
Their Jupiter 8 is pretty disappointing, to be honest. I mean, I don't know quite how they managed to model every other synth on the planet really well and not really make it with the Jupiter 8. Come on, Arturia, guys.
However, the Roland SoundCloud
is excellent.
Is excellent. Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah,
it really is. Marcellus, both of us used to own an MKS 80. Of course, it's the rack mount of the Jupiter 8.
Absolutely, yeah.
Another iconic synthesizer.
Absolutely iconic, and it was the whole MKS series, as you said to me, was pretty unique.
I had all of them except the digital piano.
The famous house piano.
You got
20.
You got one palmed off on you, did you? I skipped that one.
It was the house piano, wasn't it?
It's like really grubby sounding.
It's not posh.
I like it because of that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing for me was with those Roland modules, you got aspects of that piano sound in all of the others anyway. Especially the MKS 70, which was the Super JX, and you had that piano sound tons of it in the Super JX, which was a beautiful synth, quite an underrated synth actually, the Super JX.
Yeah.
So,
and the whole Juno series as well, Paul, with Roland. Previous to that,
the Juno 106 was my first good synth.
First love.
My first love, and I'll always love the Juno. And a lot of people talk about the Juno 60 sounding better, the Juno 6. I disagree. A Juno is a Juno. And if you can't make a good sound with a Juno, I think you ought to try something other than synthesis.
Yeah,
it's so easy to make great sound.
Exactly. You can use L plates on a Juno. You can't use L plates on a Jupiter 8, for instance.
You really can't. With a Juno 60, 106, 6, Alpha Juno, they're so simple to use, and to get great results from them is just like.
And I think
falling off a log. Yeah,
I think they were one of the first analog synthesizers to actually sound more in control. I felt a lot of the classic analog synths were out of control, and I always put that down.
Especially the Moogs,
Especially the Moogs, And I always put that down to DCOs rather than VCOs, digitally controlled voltages.
That's where it all started to go wrong for me, even though
Right.
I'm waxing
Yes, at the same time, it all went wrong there. Yeah.
even though we are waxing lyrical about Junos and Jupiters, which are digitally controlled oscillators. That was the beginning of the slippery slope of it all losing its thickness, its warmth, its all that kind of thing, wasn't it?
Or maybe it was the start of something new, Paul. FM synthesis then came in. We all hated it, but then we loved it. When we mixed it in with a Juno. So. I think it's all about knowing how to combine the different aspects of synthesizers.
I think that's great, Marcellus. Go on.
And a standard trick in the 80s was to use 3 sounds: a Juno, a DX7, and an
Obi or whatever,
or a sampler.
Absolutely.
So you had the wavetable thing coming in with PPG,
which is the biggest thing these days.
Huge, huge now.
Was a nightmare in the 80s. Wavetable synthesizers,
and the Fairlights and the Synclaviers,
all of that stuff. I've used the Synclavia and the Fairlight. I mean, the Synclavia, the price of that thing.
It was eye-watering. Yeah,
it really was.
To have one at Audio One, so
I mean,
a little one. Just a one bank,
but I think I don't want to get into samplers so much because that's a whole other subject, really.
No, but wavetable synthesis is important.
I mean, wavetable synthesis rules supreme these days. But just like always, and I know you guys are going to agree with me, the wavetable was always a thin-sounding synth, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And all these modern synths that rule the roost at the moment, like Massive and Serum, they're really thin-sounding beasties, They might have a gazillion waveforms available, but there's not one thick, rich-sounding waveform amongst a lot of them, So, what we always used to do, and what the smart person does to this day, is layer synths together. This is the billion-dollar information bite here. Don't sort of initialize a patch on a synth, start with a square wave and sort of try and build it from nothing. Get in the zone with a patch that's in that zone that you're heading for. Play with that, layer it up with 2 other synths, and that's really what we always did and still works to this day. I would say if you're making synth sounds, the best way to go is to layer them.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's about complexity in the sound, isn't it?
Of course,
that's the richness and the fatness. It's your brain going, whoa, what's going on there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, look, maybe we should get on to mixing techniques with synths. For instance, guys, and not just synths, obviously we're talking about electronic keyboards as well, organs, the Rhodes piano, the Wurlitzer piano, the Clavin Air, mixing techniques. Now, we have obviously a sound that tends to be used in most types of music, which is called a pad, right? Now, a pad really is like a big washy sound that's not particularly rhythmic, and it has a very long sustain to the sound, so it kind of hums along in the middle, in the back, etc. It is wallpaper. That's a good way of describing it, Tim. Yeah. So go on. Any tips, you guys, for working with pads? Should we start with?
Well, you don't want it to sound too dull, but you don't want it to dominate. Modulation in the stereo field,
definitely.
Chorusing, all those kind of things to make it subtly changing.
Yeah.
In the background rather than just be static where it sounds
big time. Yeah. I even use really subtle auto panning and stuff like that as well. Not very wet at all, just like barely discernible auto panning, just to sort of swirl it around a little bit.
What do you use for auto panning, Paul?
I use a free plugin, ladies and gentlemen, which is made by a company called Cable Guys, and it's called Pancake. Brilliant. Okay. It's absolutely brilliant because, back in the day, we didn't have the luxury of beat synced auto panners, did we?
Yeah.
Auto panners were just a law unto themselves. They just used to go.
We didn't have a click either, did we?
We didn't know. So do you remember delay charts, guys? And we used to have to program delays in. You couldn't just like hit a quarter note or eighth note or anything like that. You'd have a delay chart of mathematical fractions of time, and you'd have to punch that into a delay unit to get your delay.
Duplets into triplets into quadruplets, all that stuff,
Absolutely.
But we used to invent quite a few things as engineers, I think, when that process was available and not just dialing in a BPM,
Yeah.
And funnily enough, Nile Rodgers was talking about it on the Let's Dance album.
Okay.
And he said Clear Mountain was just playing around with delays, and Bowie just stopped him and said, "No, that's it.
That's it. Yeah.
That's it," and it was pretty random, what he was doing.
I think you'll find is that the delay on the horns,
and the guitar,
and it's basically a 6/4, isn't it? A dub style delay.
Right. There you go.
A 6/4. It's basically that, but a bit smudgy. Like we said, it's not mathematically accurate like a modern piece of kit where you just beat sync it, tempo sync it. It's not.
It's
so
about
it's got that
right.
funkiness about it.
It's about right, Chris. Exactly.
So it's also about feeling what was going on. If that delay felt right, then that's the delay. It doesn't matter what you were thinking or aiming for.
Yeah,
that's the way we're going. And
but often when you're doing something, you don't hear what you're doing, and it's like somebody else needs to tap you on the shoulder and say stop. That's the one. I don't know if you guys do that much, but these days I kind of always seem to go past the best thing. But because of computers, I always name what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And think, oh shit, it doesn't sound as good now. I go back half an hour earlier to a patch I named Good Patch or something. And boom, it sounds better,
That's the thing since I learned this many years ago. You save the patch again and again and again and again, the most minor of tweaks, because in a very short space of time, you can end up a million miles away from where you just had been. Just sort of going, tweak, and suddenly the sound's gone.
Yeah.
So yes, save all the time.
Especially when you're in a room on your own. It's like, how do you inspire yourself?
Yeah.
I think.
With pads, I've got a little thing I use a lot, which is I'll have one quite thick, warm pad, which is the heart of the pad.
Yes.
And doesn't have basically particularly any top end going on in it. Then I'll put quite a fizzy sort of shimmery sort of layer of another pad sound on top, sit that on top of it, and therefore we can have that shimmeriness going on. But it's not a bunch of thick middle frequencies swirling around, So that's maybe a good.
So you're giving it tonal dimensions as well as
spatial
left right dimensions, as well as modulating dimensions. And then also something I do quite a lot when I'm mixing pads is once I've got the shape of the mix, I kind of start automating the pad to the dynamic, because let's face it, if the pad gets too loud, the whole mix collapses because you can't hear the drums properly because the pads are suffocating it, So what I tend to do is work out the dynamic of a song, whether it's a beat driven track with a big chorus, or whether it's a vocal driven folk track or something. And I tend to move
There's
the pads.
a test for a mixer. That's
right. Yeah, that's right. Work your pad to the dynamic of the song, and you're gonna not have to fight it so much, and do things that you guys are talking about in terms of modulation, tonal, blah blah blah. And you got to give some kind of dimension to that sustain, otherwise the sustain will kill your drums and kill your punch.
Big time.
If it's not changing, I've got a theory that your brain starts to filter it out when you're listening.
Yeah.
Things that don't change, your brain can go, well, that's exactly the same, so we can push that.
You're
back.
talking about MP3. You're talking
Section.
about psychoacoustics here, Chris.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's how MP3 does its magic trick. It basically it knows what your brain will do for you.
Well, it guesses.
Yeah, your brain
Yeah.
will fill in the gaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or turn that off because that's
Yeah.
just doing that. Yeah. Let's concentrate on the top of the snare. So you're talking about psychoacoustics.
I hate MP3s.
Did I ever say I like them? I can't stand them. No, I can't stand them. But listen,
What don't you like about them?
I just find them really tiring to listen to. I find the bottom end's not really. It's not really like physical. I don't know.
Poor version of a WAV.
It's a poor. It's just.
And do you prefer 24-bit WAVs or 16-bit WAVs?
Well,
Or don't you mind so much about that?
I do. I don't know if I prefer one to the other.
Right.
I just
it's
by
on the
habit.
music for me.
By habit, I'm working with
Depends on the
24-bit to preserve as much as possible.
Yeah.
Knowing that at some point it's going to be
Squashed.
Squashed.
Yeah.
So
right, which is the fundamental of what we're talking about a lot of the time. A WAV might sound greater to us, but we're listening in high definition environments. People are listening in far worse conditions than an MP3. Just by their listening systems.
Sure.
So I remember back in the day, it was really important to get your mix right for FM radio or AM radio, rather.
Or do a separate mix, even.
Right, there you go. Which was difficult, but
leave that to the white coat guys, I think. But I know where Marcellus is headed with this, and I think fundamentally 90% of modern music, you might as well be 16-bit 44.1, right? That's the Nyquist theory in effect.
I love the 44.1 thing. I just cannot get on with any of the other sampling frequencies, especially 48.
Well, they're just adding extra aliasing, basically, aren't they?
Yeah, something
desperately filtering it out, supposedly above our range of our hearing, but it doesn't work. Not to my ears. So I agree with you.
Has any of you ever worked with DSD?
No, I haven't worked with it, but it seems interesting.
Yeah, I went to. I was sort of part-time journalist for a little while. Worked for a magazine called Making Music.
I remember that.
I think it was Sony did a DSD project.
Yeah,
and they flew a bunch of journalists out to some music fair. Well, they take it very seriously in Germany. The Tonmeister.
Tonmeister's serious stuff. Yeah. Good stuff.
And they did this demo where they had developed these speakers. They were 5-way speakers, and they had they went from I think 10 to 100K, and they just used on these speakers. They played 2 recordings of exactly the same thing, one 16-bit 44.1 and one DSD, and it was beautiful. I've got to say, it was absolutely beautiful.
So sorry, Paul.
Now, what's the difference in the technical spec? Because DSD rings a teensy little bell for me, but I don't really claim to know anything about it.
It's a different way of encoding that has a technically unlimited bandwidth. So
I heard the sampling frequency were gigabytes rather than kilohertz.
Yeah, I think the file's pretty big.
yeah, like that's something like 256 gig sampling rate. But in 1 bit.
But so you're preserving all that.
On my iPhone, I shoot RAW, baby. I don't care. I don't mind a bigger file for better results. Fine.
Like in the analog, if something remains completely analog, there are frequencies going on that are supersonic, and the sort of frequency response of the recording medium isn't really capturing that especially accurately, but it's there, and it has modulation effect on the lower frequencies. So I think their idea was that if you capture all that, you have a more analog sound, basically.
More accurate, maybe. Yeah. Really interesting. Talking about analog sound.
Yeah.
What about the Fender Rhodes? Because we were kind of talking about pads here, and the Fender Rhodes is sort of an instrument that tends to be, I think, can be included into the pad department, because it often pads out chords, doesn't it, without an awful lot of movement. And I find it a pain to mix Rhodes. You guys got any tips? Because it's so thick in the lower mids, and it's just sort of, it wants to take over the lower mids in a mix, doesn't it?
Well, I think it does, especially, I mean, if it's being used as a lead sound, and you know, you're just lifting up the sound of a Fender Rhodes, then suddenly it does tend to get in the way if you're not careful.
Yeah, yeah.
It is a big sound.
Yeah.
It also, as you said, it encapsulates that frequency, I guess, around 400 to 700 hertz that you don't hear, but it's really loud, actually, because you don't really hear it, perceive it, rather, as being loud.
Well, 400 to 700, let's just put this in perspective. That's like Oxford Circus on a Saturday afternoon, isn't it? You know, pretty busy.
Yes.
With all these, well, yeah, but they're all electric cars these days.
I'm talking about the people on foot at Oxford Circus, billions of them milling around. I mean, there's a lot of activity in a mix around 400 to 700, right?
Yeah, and an illustration of this frequency perception is like a trumpet compared to a flugelhorn. You know, you hear a flugelhorn, it's fatter, and you're looking at the meter and it's hitting 0, and you're thinking, that doesn't sound half as loud as the trumpet I just listened to at -10, you know. So, this alludes to those, what are they called? The Fletcher-Munson curves.
Fletcher-Munson curves, yeah.
Where you perceive different frequencies, different loudnesses, you know, at different volumes.
Puny little human ears are basically geared towards high mid, aren't they?
Right.
That's
you go. Well, the ear canal resonance is 3.7K, which just gives you a tip as to, unless our body's hearing it, you know, at a volume, we're not perceiving it the same, because there's a roll off in your ears.
Mate, can I just say, I'm sure you guys are aware of this, but Fletcher-Munson curves were actually first measured for Bell Laboratories. Bell Laboratories, famously, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and they wanted an experiment done on which frequencies would be most perceivable when someone's listening to a voice on a phone.
Phones are a big thing, Paul. In fact, Moog originally started designing filters for phones. You know, it was a big, and a lot of the great analog pieces of compressor and stuff like that were invented for phones originally, so you could get a signal down the phone. You know, without distortion.
Yes, it makes sense. It's all about communication, isn't it? In the first place.
Yeah. So, we've got our pad. The last thing with the pad stroke Rhodes sort of thing, anything sort of comping chords and holding them down, sustaining them. I mean, I tend to spread them pretty wide, kind of help the other instruments in the mix get some space. Yeah. You guys too?
Oh, definitely. Phasing.
Sorry?
I said watch for phasing when you're spreading really wide.
Absolutely.
There's an awful lot of kids these days that don't seem to get taught anything about that. I've walked in on mixing sessions and had all the kids vibing away while they're listening to their mix, and I'm going, whoa, you know, this thing's completely out of phase. And you mention that to someone and they're going, what do you mean? I go, can't you hear it? And they don't hear it because it's not sort of
great advice too.
It's not flagged up as a warning sign in their head.
Check it in mono.
Oh yeah,
and if it disappears, you're in deep shit.
But can I just say to you, I suggest to you guys, I listen to a lot of old and new music, and you know, in the old days, what did we do? We just had a stereo source, and we pan the left all the way to the left, and the right all the way to the right, and to this day, that sounds plenty wide enough to me. Does it not?
Yeah.
I mean, we only have 2 ears, so, you know, we've got sources ultimately of where the sound's coming from.
Well, I think also the front, left, right, middle panning is what I kind of go for these days. either chuck it really wide left and right or up the middle, you know.
I tend to treat it like a clock. You know, the old analogy of the soundstage that we were all taught. You know, and what I tend to do is do a soundstage approach. So if my let's call our pad kind of strings, that's kind of enveloping the whole mix, and then other synth sounds, I just sort of this o'clock, that o'clock sort of thing, but not the middle. Me personally, because I think it's sacred ground for the lead vocal, the snare drum, the kick drum, and often the bass.
I tend to go in the middle with frequencies that don't overlap. So I might have a bass, I might have a pad in the middle.
Great point.
But like you all said, you really need some psychoacoustic thing with a pad to keep you interested. But I do go for the middle, and I go hard left with the panning because I use Huss effect stuff to make it come in if I want. So basically with Huss effect, if it's coming from your right hand side, your left ear is going to hear it later and duller.
Absolutely.
So I'd rather put it on the right hand side completely and then put a Huss effect on the other side.
Can I ask you, Marcellus, to explain the Huss effect a little bit further, because a lot of younger people won't really know. That's the original.
Okay, source is coming from here. Equal amount of left and right information going to your pinnacles or your ears, right? Source is coming from here. It's going to reach this ear before it reaches this ear, because it goes around your head or it hits the side of the wall and comes back with the early reflection. So what I do is I pan an instrument hard right, then I set up some kind of delay, because that's all Huss effect is, and frequency. So I'll roll off a bit of the top of the return of that instrument on the other side with a bit of a delay and bring it up, but hard left panned. So between my balance here and here, I get a more accurate representation of this instrument coming from this side of my head, rather than if it's come from the front of my head, I don't need to worry about that. Henceforth, that's why I go left, right, Huss effect, and in the middle. Boom.
Brilliant. How about
I didn't know what it was called, but I do it. But I didn't
know. There you go.
It is. So what about reverb, guys? Because I tend to put reverb more so on synths and keyboards than other things in the mix, because we also have the depth of field that we can play with, don't we? You know, and I want certain things like the lead vocal, the snare drum, the bass to be close to me, and I want other stuff to be further back, and I tend to find that keyboards, synths and stuff, I tend to put further back in the mix. How about you guys?
Creating the soundscape, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So that depends on the sounds you're using. So what you're trying to get them to do as an effect. Do you want them really atmospheric? Do you want them to alert you to something that's going on from one side to the other? Are they supposed to catch your attention or not? Some things are supposed to just be calm and give you a mellow, floaty feeling in the background, and other things highlight or go even further and become
let's get into, I mean, because there's the other type of thing that synths get used a lot for, and electric keyboards, which is those little arpeggiated, often single note lines. It might be an arpeggiated line, it might just be a riff, like if you think of Bernie Worrell with Funkadelic, that's certainly not a pad, it's not even playing chords, it's a single note line. How do you tend to work with those guys, those kind of sounds, for instance?
Well, delay is straight away. I find that's a really good way of making, because sometimes especially a synth line can sound very isolated compared to a mix if it's just like raw naked. And put a bit of delay on it, fiddle with the speed and the feedback so it's not interfering with the melody. Suddenly it's
modulation. I tend to do that, as with guitars, some modulation effects on those kind of synth lines.
Definitely.
I mean, it's about giving things character. So anything you can add to something, because the synth tends to be, in its essence, a very fixed sort of sound, and it's really up to you to make it move. in my book.
I think as well, it's a really excellent example of a person using a synthesizer to express their personality. You know, I felt that the analog synths always, you had cats like Bernie Worrell, who, let's face it, was hands up, right? Because he was just in another dimension. You know, for me, funk music. You got to mention Bernie Worrell, you know.
Absolutely.
And these synthesizers we're talking about seem to. You take another cat like take the Mini Moog. It could be across genres, Paul.
Well,
you know?
Rick,
there we
Rick,
say it. Yeah,
love you,
Rick. But let's also say Chick Corea when we're talking about the Mini Moog.
Herbie Hancock and Jan Hammer and those guys with the Mini Moog.
I felt with Herbie though, he was more of a synth orchestrator.
He was an ARP as well. He didn't. Really
he was everything, wasn't he? Yeah.
He was more of an ARP user than a Moog user.
Yeah.
He used the Mini Moog, but he used the ARP for
sparingly.
Stuff. George Duke, we have to give a big shout out to. Jan Hammer, Chick Corea.
The first big Moog record, wasn't that Switched on Bach?
It was indeed.
1968 or something.
Was that Kraftwerk?
Wendy Carlos.
Well, became Kraftwerk's time. Yeah.
Well, Kraftwerk spawned the whole electronic synthesizer thing, didn't it?
Big time.
You know, this was 68.
So you got different aspects of how these synthesizers work. To me, you got these cats who could perform, these cats who wrote songs, right? So you take a song like "Stir It Up," Bob Marley, right?
Love it.
Obviously a great songwriter. And using a Mini Moog in reggae, you know. Then you had all kinds of people, you know, like Springsteen, born in USA. That's a CS80, isn't it?
You know, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, of course it is.
Yeah. So songwriters loved them, performers loved them, you know, and orchestrators loved them.
Yeah.
Because you could just express stuff completely, you know, as to what your personality is, you know, across the genres. So that's really the thing that interests me with analog synthesizers, you know.
I really enjoy it. I love listening to the Marvin Gaye 70s stuff, the way he synthesizers.
You're going to see I Want You album, I'm guessing, because
it's like
half of that album is instrumental with the Mini Moog just playing.
Didn't get better than
solos.
That. Yeah.
It's almost like you don't even think about the fact it's a synthetic sound. But it's quite raw the way that it was always mixed, like pretty simply. Just it's there, you know. I just really good. Really.
And I think those 3 Stevie Wonder records, Fulfilling This, his first finale, Inner Visions and Talking Book.
Absolutely.
Now, man, that was go on. Off the chain. I'll just go ahead. Yeah.
Tonto's expanding headband.
Well, that's where I was going, because that synth used on those was Tonto.
Yeah.
And that was a huge modular synth.
Yeah.
And the guys had a band where they used that synth, and they called the band Tonto's Expanding Headband. And they were early. I wonder what their recreational behavior was like. And
must have been good.
I guess they were enjoying themselves. Yeah.
Yes.
And so they brought Tonto into the studio with Stevie, didn't they? And wow, I'm so glad that happened, because those early 70s Stevie albums are benchmark to me. And can I just add to that? You see, this is quite interesting, and it might be interesting for people trying to get that retro sound. The Isley Brothers at the time as well did the same thing. They were using monophonic synths, would only play one note at a time. So when they wanted to play chords, what they would do was, Stevie, the Isleys, they would play the notes in separately, of course. And what you'd end up with was something that was chordal, but wasn't regimented to being every note's playing exactly the same as every other note within that.
Polyphony.
More like an orchestra.
Polyphony.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. And to me, Stevie Wonder, Isley Brothers, from the early 70s to mid 70s, to me, that is a beautiful example of, why not try that sometimes, guys out there, you know, people out there. Just rather than just sort of play a chord, let your DAW sequence it and play it all beautifully back. how about you play each note of that accordion separately and put a bit of expression into each single note, because you'll end up with something pretty groovy.
Yeah. Again, you're adding interest, aren't you? You're adding like subtle
Yes,
complexity.
ear candy.
And it's the basis of African music, polyphony. Africans do not play chords like this. You know, the polyphonies cross each other, like you're saying. And that's the essence of pop music. Pop music is based on African music, pentatonic scales.
Sure is.
So, you know, when we had the soul evolution, and in parallel with the analog synthesizer thing, we had a lot more of that coming into popular music. I think from that moment onwards.
Yeah,
you know,
I hear that. That kind of helps me get onto the next thing here, which is compression, because obviously African music tends to be very rhythmic, and it therefore is a candidate for quite sort of strict compression. Now, how about you guys? Because I don't tend to find that synths generally are dynamic enough to feel that they need me to start compressing them, or at least compress them much at all, especially pads. I never compress pads. Yeah,
there's no point. But yeah, you were talking about Rhodes earlier. That's definitely a candidate for a lot of compression. It's such a dynamic, even within a note, there's a massive dynamic.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Attack and the sustain.
Yeah. Therefore, the word
represent it all. Yeah.
I think definitely compression on bass for me, because naturally the phenomenon of a speaker cone moving less.
Yeah.
For bass is what you sometimes, or a lot of the time, need. You know,
and stability.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Gives stability to a track, and you know, so you do want that solid. I would say as solid as the drums.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's what, you know, it's personal taste. Everything's personal. So.
Yeah. I just find synths. I mean, let's think about it. For many years, synths didn't even have velocity sensitivity. There was no velocity information at all. And even to this day, they're not very velocity sensitive compared to a lot of real instruments, voices, and interestingly enough, electronic keyboards. I mean, let's talk about the Clavin Air. I mean, we talked about Stevie Wonder. You know, now that is a very velocity. I mean, that's like a rhythm guitar, the way it behaves in the track, isn't it? And I definitely compress that a lot.
Definitely. Expand as well. Expand as well.
And stick through some kind of like either a preamp or a distortion
box. Yeah,
sure. It's quite a thin sound on its own, the clavinet.
It's quite an annoying sound. I'm not actually a fan of the clavinet as an instrument.
No,
I became a fan after I listened to Stevie, though. I have to say. And Herbie as well. On that Headhunters record, he smashes it on the clav. It's like, whoa. Clavin Roads we're talking about. They're quite good foils. Actually.
You just sold it to me.
Yeah. the two together, the soft and the thin, you know, thing. Played by the right player. And I don't know if you noticed, cats like Stevie and Herbie, when they play a clavinet, they don't play it with curved fingers. They play it with straight fingers like that. Check it out next time you watch them play. Both of them do it. They do that rather than that.
So it's more percussive or less percussive?
No, so basically they can get their timing better because there's no curve.
You're hitting a drum.
You know, you're hitting like a drum.
Right. So more. Yeah.
You wouldn't play a drum like that. You know, you play a drum like that.
Right. Straight arm.
Yeah. So you got the timing. You know.
Now, how about this? Back in the day, we used to, now this happened with everybody, when a new synth came out, when a new synth hit town, everybody used to get it and rinse out the presets. It's true. People like, in the 70s, Stevie got given them first. And then he would use all these sounds, and then everyone would just jump. I mean, when the DX7 came out, people just rinsed out the presets. The same with so many other synths. You know, in the 90s, Teddy Riley would rinse out the latest synths to get there first with the presets and all this kind of stuff. And you know, a couple of great synths that became the sound of a generation have mysteriously not really made it into the world of plug-in emulations. One of those, believe it or not, is the EMU Proteus.
Never really used that much myself.
Everybody was using a Proteus, man. I had
That was the one with there were different editions of it.
Yes.
Is that one?
Yes.
So there was a classical string one, and there was a sort of general.
And like the JV1080, the Roland JV1080 was like that as well.
Yeah.
Strange enough that I'm just looking at a Proteus and a JV1080 here in my studio because I couldn't get rid of them.
There's no point in getting rid of them unless you're like me. You know, I mean, do you remember the vintage keys, EMU vintage keys?
Oh,
yeah.
These were hugely part of the sound of the records of those times. You know,
it's equivalent of a library, wasn't it? Of like a sound library that you get with Logic or something.
But they were early sound libraries. I mean, that was the era when I started going, well, okay, it kind of emulates the original, but it's not really the original.
We didn't have contact with 100 gigabytes of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra to go for. We had a couple of little floppy disks to put in an archive, some really bad samples of strings, or we could go to our JV1080 or our Proteus and grab some strings that sounded good.
Well, but somebody mentioned it to me the other day, and I'd sort of forgotten what a bonus living in somewhere like London is. And you got London, New York, LA, where you have rental.
Talk about that, folks.
Where you have rental companies, and if you want something, it's possible to get at in a phone call, and however long it takes them to deliver it. But most studios around the world, they've got what they've got. And they don't have rental companies in a lot of places.
No, we got Deliveroo, innit?
Yeah, and so we forget how spoiled we are, kind of in London and in and around, where you have access to stuff that a lot of people will never have access to. I mean, you can even. I mean, I remember we used to use. He's the guy who plays organ for.
I know Rod Argent.
No. It's
Argent.
Doesn't matter. A big Irish singer. Let's put it that way. Van Morrison, and his keyboard player always had a Hammond B3 that he insisted on having, so much so that he'd actually scratched his initials on the underside, so he could always tell if it was the one he wanted. Yeah, and that was the go-to Hammond, for example.
Yeah.
But,
can anybody explain to me how Hammond works? I've always wanted to know.
It was the first electronic keyboard, and it is completely and utterly derived from Alexander Graham Bell's phone technology. Right? And what happened with phone technology was they needed to work out a way to get a signal further and further and further. So what they did was, and what they still do, is they had telegraph poles, and they have little amplifiers on the telegraph poles, so that the signal will travel the length of a cable, get to an amplifier, which sends it to the next one, and so on and so forth. In those days, it was valves or tubes that were used to amplify that signal for the telephone. So what people realized was that these tubes, shall we call them, were emitting tones, right? Just in their normal working practice, they would emit tones. So somebody came up with a brilliant idea of, hey, how about we got a bunch of tubes and we tuned them? And then actually sort of trigger them from a keyboard, a piano-style keyboard, and then we could play that sound. Believe it or not, guys, that is the origin of the electronic organ.
Well, okay.
I've taught that stuff at university, guys.
Yeah. So like using a tube as like an organ pipe.
Absolutely. That's nail, head, hit. That's it.
And then it's fundamentally, or can be, a sustained sound, so a paddy kind of sound. So that's where the Leslie comes in, right?
Absolutely.
Because you get the modulation from
That's a bizarre bit of kit, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Great for modulation, isn't it? I mean,
wow. Yeah.
It sounds great on guitars as well.
Yeah. Do mad effects on a Leslie.
Yeah. For those who don't know, look it up. It's a rotary cabinet speaker, and it is a speaker that's furiously spinning round, or at two different speeds, traditionally, either fast or slow, spinning round on an axis in a cabinet. Whoa.
And we're talking about stereo fields a lot with keyboard sounds, aren't we?
We really are, and I like the fact that you come back to this. Yeah,
and that for me is a genius invention. The Leslie,
really,
it's like I really find it difficult with some of the keyboard virtual instruments that when you play a voicing, it changes where the top notes come out of with the left and right. It really confuses the heck out of me when I listen to it. So what I do with those instruments, I pan it to one side and then do a split, a fake stereo split, because the different notes coming out of different sides all the time just drives me mad.
Freaky. Yeah.
I don't know what that's all about, but there's a lot of keyboards that do that.
I know. Yeah, they hadn't quite got it right back in the day. For instance, the early days of polyphony were a bit like the early days of stereo, weren't they?
Right.
You know, you hear some early stereo mixes from the 60s, and it's like, well, the drummer and the singer are on the left, and the guitarist and the orchestra are on the right, sort of like.
Or Coltrane on one side and Jimmy Cobb on the other side. It didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, or you know, if you've listened to the early stereo, that they managed to cobble together a stereo version of Kind of Blue, and annoyingly enough, they've got Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley on the same side of the stereo. I mean, as if it wasn't difficult enough to discern who was who when they were put solo. So hey, this is great. I mean, to summarize, I think we started off on a good foot with you, Marcellus, when you were talking about adding modulation. You know, just keep synthy sounds moving. I mean,
keep it interesting.
Keep them interesting, and rather than static. And like the Fender Roads has that classic thing that's all, well, I mean, people just throw effects at the Roads, don't they? You know, phasers, chords, but particularly that auto pan thing. Maybe is that there to get the Roads the hell out of the way of the singer's space and the bass player's space or something? You know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's.
I think there was fundamentally two Road sounds to me. The stage, which was brighter,
73,
and it didn't have a stereo really, and the suitcase, which was the classic Herbie sound, you know, where you got that jazz kind of sound and that jazz frequency in it.
And that had the panning was built into the cabinet. That's right. That crazy throw it left, throws it to the left and right.
I mean, it's a little bit mental, isn't it? But it does work, I guess. Probably mainly because we've become used to that being what happens with Roads.
And I think the amplifiers in the suitcase were really good for that as well. You know, it gave you a different sound to the stage, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's really, really true. How about, I mean, for our younger viewers, how would we, I mean, the difference, for instance, between the two most famous electric pianos being the Fender Rhodes and the Wurlitzer, would you guys like to identify that? Why use the Whirly, not the Rhodes, or the Rhodes, not the Whirly in a given instance?
For me, it's one of those things that it's intuitive. I don't know why.
The Rhodes sounds more melancholy to me.
Yeah, a lot of keyboard players I know have got Whirlies, but they use plug-in Rhodes. So maybe that's alluding to something that we've been talking about in this program. What do you think, Paul?
Well, the Fender Rhodes, or the Rhodes, should we call it, was one of the earliest examples of successful emulation in the plug-in world of a real-world instrument, wasn't it?
Yes.
The kind of first they got really good was drums, obviously, drum machines and stuff like that. Kind of, well, the next two, and they got it plenty good enough with the Rhodes and the organ, weren't they? I mean, from the beginning of plugins, there've been decent electric pianos and organ plugins, haven't there?
I guess the organ's the easiest one to model, isn't it? Because it's effectively it's just fundamental tones layered up on top of each other.
not too difficult harmonically to capture, right?
Well, this is it, and back to harmonics, because the organ, the way it works is it's like back to one of our previous sessions. You're adding harmonics with the drawbars with an organ, aren't you? You're actually, that's what you're doing. You're adding extra harmonics to change the tone.
Right.
Originally opening up different sets of pipes that operated at different different harmonics, different frequencies. So it's kind of synthesis, but on a that's additive synthesis, isn't it?
It's additive.
Okay,
Most 100% it is additive.
There's no envelopes, modulation.
No.
So it's going to be simple to emulate.
The earliest example of additive or any synthesis is the electronic organ. And with that, say it again, sorry, Chris.
The pipe organ, the original church organ.
Pipe organ. That wasn't electric, was it?
No. Okay, no. If you
I'm talking about synthesis. Right. I'm talking about electron. Well, anyway, no. Interesting point. I mean, the actual pipe organ goes back to ancient times. You know that.
Oh yeah.
You know the origins of the organ. I'll tell you what they were. They were to make the biggest pipe organ possibly, and they were warning signs for invasions of towns and cities.
Oh really?
That's what they were invented for.
See, the military always drives research, doesn't it?
And we're going back to, Egyptian and before Egyptian times. They used to have the massive pipe organs, and they would sound them off so that everybody that hell knew there was an invasion happening.
Okay.
Hey, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have been audio snobs as ever. We have been giving you guys sound advice. So do hit the like, do comment, because we will interact with you. Do subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Peace.